everyone again. Michael Musante, CER. We are so happy for you all to be joining us this evening. We have a wonderful program in store for all of you. It is Veterans Day today. If you notice, this is not an apple for education. This is a poppy. Our friends in Europe who fought alongside us started this tradition, and I have kept it up for a number of years. So that is my poppy on the thing. And I believe that we have a short video on Veterans Day, and we want to share with you a very short video on history.com that really puts into perspective what this day means and what it is supposed to mean for everyone.
Flags hang from homes, businesses, even car antennas. Ceremonies remember those who dutifully served their nation. It's Veterans Day, or Remembrance Day, as it's known in much of the world, a time to honor members of the armed forces. And it all began in a railroad car with a document to end the war, to end all wars. World War I, also known as the Great War, shocked the global community with its unprecedented toll in human life. Untold millions were killed. Germany was running low on manpower and supplies, so they agreed to sign an armistice, or truce, in the French commander Ferdinand Foch's private rail car. On the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, all was quiet on the Western Front. The fighting had ended. Exactly 1 year later, President Woodrow Wilson decreed that Americans should observe a moment of silence at 11 a.m. to remember the armistice and to embrace the peace. Other Allied nations commemorated the peaceful anniversary as well. In England and Canada, citizens wore paper poppies. Poppies had become a symbol of the armistice. The poem Flanders Field described a one-time battlefield. In Flanders Field, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row. In America, the nation's first unknown soldier was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery on Armistice Day, 1921. He was a casualty of the Great War. Since that first memorial, other unknown soldiers from America's wars have been interred in the tomb. And it's become tradition for the president or one of his representatives to lay a wreath on the monument every November 11th. A resolution was passed in 1926 inviting all Americans to remember Armistice Day and the soldiers who fought so hard for peace. The idea caught on. By 1938, the day was marked with so many ceremonies and parades, Congress made it a legal holiday, giving people the day off work. After World War II and the Korean War, Americans wanted to open up the holiday to include not just World War I veterans, but all who served in combat. In 1954, President Dwight Eisenhower, a World War II vet himself, legally changed the U.S. Armistice Day to Veterans Day, honoring those who served in all American wars. For a brief time, starting in 1971, Congress moved the holiday to the fourth Monday in October, giving Americans a 3-day weekend. But most people rejected the idea. The traditional date of November 11th, the anniversary of the Great War's ceasefire, was too historically important to forget. President Ford reversed the law in 1975, returning Veterans Day back to its rightful date. Over the decades, the holiday has changed with the times. Originally, it was a call for world peace. Then in the U.S., it became a day to remember war veterans. Today, Veterans Day is set aside to honor not just those who served in war, but also those who have served their nation in peace.
Thank you very much. And to continue with this veteran theme, I'd like to introduce all of you. It is my extreme pleasure to introduce to you a very old veteran, General Alexander Hamilton, who in fact was aide de camp to the father of our country, George Washington. Mr. Hamilton, General Hamilton, welcome, sir. I do appreciate your being able to join us. If you could share some of your experiences from the time that you were serving as the aide de camp, as well as some of our other matters that I think we're going to be discussing with you tonight.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Musante and Mr. Staton and Madison. Thank you so much for welcoming me here, and particularly on a day honoring veterans. I can't help but think of my own dear friend, John Lawrence, who we lost in the very late part of the war, as well as many other friends along the way. When I first met General Washington, he did not remark me much. It was in New York, and I think you know perhaps how the battles worked in New York City. When the war broke out, we didn't go to war, the war came to us. The Redcoats surrounded us. Well, it didn't go well at all. We had to retreat. We retreated the length of York Island, or Manhattan Island, I think in your day. We fought rearguard actions at Harlem Heights, at White Plains, made them pay there, I can tell you. But ultimately, we had to retreat into New Jersey. And retreating is a dismal business at best, but there is no more dismal place to retreat to than New Jersey. We retreated the width of New Jersey, crossing the river into Pennsylvania. Now, we recrossed the Delaware, surprising Colonel Rawl and his Hessians at Trenton. I tell you, my favorite view of Trenton is down the barrel of a cannon. A few days later, General sought to entrap us. A few days later, General Cornwallis sought to entrap us in Trenton, and General Washington had us countermarch, and we took them at Princeton instead. I don't suppose any of you would know this, but before the war, I had applied to the College of New Jersey at Princeton and been denied. Well, as the 40th and 55th Regiments of Foot fell back on Nassau Hall, I got into the College of New Jersey at Princeton with cannon. I understand there might be some younger folk in our audience today. If you were to apply to university, you perhaps ought to use pen and paper. Cannon only worked for myself, and then of course they closed the school shortly thereafter. Now, in the aftermath of the battles of Trenton and Princeton, His Excellency had taken note of me all along the retreat through New Jersey, and he asked me to become one of his aide-de-camp. An aide-de-camp is a sort of military secretary, if you will. The duties of an aide-de-camp are many and varied. They include the interrogation of prisoners, the interrogation of spies, very infrequently acting in the general's name, such as I did when I went north to retrieve of General Gates the troops he would no longer be using in the aftermath of Arnold's victory at Saratoga. Make no mistake, I said Arnold's victory at Saratoga. At the beginning of the war, we had perhaps no better general than Benedict Arnold, despite his later betrayal. But certainly that victory lays to him. Gates stayed in his tent. I digress. Serving General Washington as an aide-de-camp. Duties are interrogation of prisoners, interrogation of spies, very infrequently acting in the general's name, but more often than not, it was the day-to-day administration of the army. For every order that needs to be given must be written down. And who do you suppose did all that writing? We did. I remember very early in my tenure with General Washington, he brought me into his office to explain what he expected of an aide-de-camp. He said, I need good penmen, not just a fellow who can draft a letter in a fair hand, and I can, but he would want to bring you into his presence. He would outline the salient points of a letter or order, and then he would expect you to go away and bring back a 3, 4, 5, 6 page letter or order, not just hitting the points that the general had asked for, but in essence, speaking with the general's voice. This is something I think I did rather well, almost to my detriment, for I had opportunities later in the war for advancement, and I was passed by, chiefly because General Washington thought that I was necessary to him. Now, I don't want to go on over long about the war, but I'm very often asked why I feel we need such a strong federal government, why we need such a strong federal authority. If I can go back to the retreat through New Jersey, I was at the time a captain of artillery, artillery of the big guns, mortars, cohorns, cannon. And it was my custom at that time to walk alongside the cannon, and I would pat the cannon as I would walk along, absorbed in thought. And I couldn't help but notice the tracks in front of me, the wagon wheels, the hoofprints of the horses and the footprints of the men. Very often shod, but very often, like as not, unshod. You know, cold goes through leather like that. And once leather becomes saturated or permeated due to inclement weather, it becomes very dry and brittle. Upon drying, the men would try to tie the shoes on their feet with rags and scraps, but ultimately they would fall away. And we would be looking at bare footprints in the snow and the muck and the mire. And then, of course, because skin itself is nothing more than leather, that too would begin to open up, and we would be seeing bloody footprints. And we saw them all throughout the war. We saw it on the retreat through New Jersey. We saw it at Morristown. We saw it at Valley Forge. I began to ask myself, why have we come to such desperate straits? Why is there no proper sustenance for our troops? Men give me some credit for genius. All the genius I have lies in this. When I have a subject in hand, my mind becomes pervaded by it. Day and night it is before me. I plumb the problem to its very depths. Then the results of my reflections, some men are pleased to call the fruit of genius. It is the fruit of labor and thought. And what was the trouble? It was the government we had at the time. A government, the Articles of Confederation, a government under which we could not properly support our troops. When I became aide-de-camp to General Washington, it became my job to help him feed and clothe the army, something we fought all throughout the war to do. In essence, that was a second front that we were fighting on. Now, I have been asked to keep my speech very, very brief, but thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Hamilton. And we are going to come back to you. We are going to get some thoughts on the other big event that we have had here in November in our United States, and that is the election of the president. And we're going to have Mr. Madison, who's going to comment on the creation of the Electoral College, the other aspects of the U.S. Constitution that govern how our elections are held. And we are going to bring you back, Mr. Hamilton, because I'm sure that you will want to converse a bit with your friend on these topics as well. So let's turn this over to Mr. Madison. Mr. Madison, President Madison, if we could please have you come aboard. Thank you, sir. Welcome. If you could enlighten us as you were writing the Constitution with regard to this big event that we just recently had.
Well, first I would like to acknowledge the unwavering gratitude that this nation owes to its veterans. We must always hold our veterans in the highest regard for standing in defense of our liberties. That said, in discussing the Electoral College and how it came to be, well, during the discussions and debates during the Constitution Convention on that subject, there were many modes of appointment that were offered. Should the executive be elected immediately by the people, or should he be chosen by by chosen electors, chosen by the people? Should he be chosen from the executives of the several states, or perhaps even by the legislature? The legislature also had other difficulties. How would the ballot take place? Would it be a ballot from both houses? It was offered that a candidate may be chosen from the lower house, whom then several candidates chosen from the lower house, and then one of whom would be chosen by the Senate. Having the legislature involved in choosing of the chief executive was quite difficult to fathom. It was no less than a dangerous prospect for the framework of our Constitution. a candidate, say, of the legislature might very well intrigue with the predominant faction, and if elected, would then possibly turn his administration and render it subservient to the views and interests of the faction he represented, thereby degrading the framework of our free government. So this was quite untenable. Choosing our executive from the people at large. Well, there were issues of suffrage among our various states. Suffrage was more diffusive in the northern states. Also, one regard might be that citizens might choose a member of their own state, regardless of who that may be. That put the smaller states at a distinct disadvantage with regard to population. Or should the executive be chosen by electors, chosen by the people? Now, this mode seemed to have the least amount of objection by the various delegates, and as you may well know, was the expedient chosen. It had distinct advantages in that the electors were chosen by the people. They would then meet on that occasion for just that singular purpose. They would immediately proceed on that purpose and achieve their objective. The time frame, and perhaps even meet at a location separate from the reins of government, so that there seemed to be less of an opportunity for cabal or corruption to take place. And as I say, for lack of any other disagreement among the various delegates present, this mode of election was deemed the most proper for the executive.
Thank you, Mr. Madison.
You're welcome.
We are going to bring in at this time someone to bring a little bit of a 21st century spin on this. Carrie Sotner of the National Constitution Center, as well as Lawrence Staten, who is with the Washington Latin Public Charter School here in Washington, D.C. Attendees, please put your questions in the question and answer tool, and we are happy to get any of these two distinguished gentlemen, or Ms. Sotner or Ms. Staten, Mr. Staten, to answer these questions. But what we would like to do is expand this conversation a little larger into some of the challenges today, some of the items being raised or the arguments being raised about the Electoral College. But Ms. Sotner, I will turn it over to you and your extensive knowledge of the Constitution and all that occurred with it over these years.
Hi, everybody. Great to see you all here. Please let me know if you can hear me okay. I'm in a really big room that has not just amazing sound, but also amazing people. So just to be clear, I love General Hamilton and President Madison. I get to have your likeness beside me very often when I work at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia. So if you can see right behind me, right there is Mr. Madison. And as I spin around, and hopefully don't get everybody nauseous, I will move around to be able to see Mr. Hamilton. So I thought it would be really fun to kind of give you all a bird's eye view to yourselves, but also to what we refer to lovingly as Signers Hall at the National Constitution Center. So this room was made with the life-size statues of all the men who signed the Constitution and 3 men who refused to sign the Constitution. missing an important document. Madison, maybe I'll ask you about that later if we can get to that as well. But it is great to come live from the National Constitution Center. I'm their Chief Learning Officer at the Constitution Center. And I'd love to talk to you more about the Electoral College, kind of what's going on with it today, what are the questions around it, and then I even have some questions for Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Madison about their ideas behind the Electoral College. Questionably, really, it all begins with why so difficult? And that is the key question we get from students across the country is we don't have a direct vote for our president in the United States. We have the Electoral College. So it's broken up by population as well as how many senators you have. So each state has a different number that we probably looked at way too much in the last week. But why is the system set that way? Why did we make it that way? Why did we just go for popular vote? And I can swing around to Wilson if we want to talk about Wilson and his ideas behind that. But also really engage in a lively conversation about the constitutional questions around the Electoral College and the different perspectives from our constitutional lawyers around the pros and cons of the Electoral College, why it works, how does it work, and then having a conversation around it. Throughout the program tonight, I'll be sneaking in different tools that we have at the Constitution Center online at constitutioncenter.org that can really help you out with all those things. I also have a support system in the other half of the webinar. One of our team members, her name is Madison. Absolutely have to hire anybody named Madison at the Constitution Center, but she'll be also sharing some of those links in the chat as well. So excited to have you here, excited to be here, and I can't wait to dive even more into those key questions about the Electoral College, about faithless electors, about accuracy of the vote, all these really fun things tonight.
Mr. Sautner, if I may. Now,
Doctor, but it's okay.
Did you want to start? Very well, I'll leap on in. In framing a government, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, you must oblige it to control itself. I'm very often asked my opinion of the Constitution, and I will tell you, I never expect to see perfect work from imperfect man. And though there wasn't a man jack of us who was completely satisfied with the document when we left that September day of 1787, we all felt we had something we could work with. Now, surprisingly, very few people had objections to our system for electing a president of these United States. Chiefly, the difficulties were around an absolutely unnecessary Bill of Rights that was superimposed on the Constitution and is absolutely unnecessary to have. Mr. Madison and I and Mr. Jay wrote those articles in the packet in the Daily Advertiser that came to be known as the Federalist Papers to help Americans better understand how the Constitution would better all of our lives.
Awesome. I know we also have an educator in this group with us. I'm an educator in a non-traditional sense, but we also have Lawrence. So I'd love to introduce Lawrence into this conversation too, and then we can dive into the questions that are already coming in from the Q&A and hear what President Madison would like to share as well.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here with all of you. And Dr. Sautner, I want to just say thank you for the work you do. My students have visited the National Constitution Center several times in previous years, and they love hanging out in Senators Hall. As an educator, I teach 6th grade. One of the questions I get as an educator, and it's good I can ask General Hamilton and President Madison, with the Electoral College being kind of divisive as it is, and both of you having very strong feelings about factions and political parties, how do you feel about this idea that we have quote unquote red states and blue states, and that, you know, there aren't too many states that, you know, there are very few states that kind of decide a presidential election?
I'm not certain about this red state and blue state idea. Are you talking about them being divisive between the Republican Democrats or the Democratic Republicans, whatever they're calling themselves these days, and we, the Federalists?
I'm talking about, like, red states are traditionally seen as Republicans, and blue states are traditionally seen as Democrats.
Those
I mean, how do you feel about the fact?
In my time.
Oh, no, they're different parties now. I mean, I'm sure in your day, the Democratic Republicans are one thing, but nowadays they're totally different.
Extraordinary.
Yes, well, in our day, there were the differences between the northern states and the southern states, the eastern states, as they were referred to. There were the merchant states. They held more sway with regard to banking interests, mercantile interests. Whereas the more agrarian states to the south, there were many ways one could look at how to divide our country. All the while, we are attempting to unite it. One must, in such an endeavor, strive to repress local considerations and make a sacrifice for the greater good. But
I'm glad to hear you say that, Mr. Madison, as the laws of the nation must be supreme and the laws of the states notwithstanding. Very often it appears that the Democratic Republicans or Republican Democrats adhere to the states and believe that they ought to have the more power than the federal government, even decrying that state law ought to be held preeminent as opposed to national law. And of course, that nothing could be farther than the truth. It is, as Cicero has said, when two laws stand in direct confrontation with one another, it is the law that affects the greater number of people, hence the nation, that must be held in preeminence.
well, go ahead.
I did receive a modern question from the Q&A. So before I turn it back to you two to tell me the foundation and for Lawrence to share kind of what his students are doing in the classroom and what he's doing in the classroom, I wanted to kind of jump in here. There was a question about, would you please offer a solution to problems you picked up on? So, and this really goes it goes back to you guys in a minute, because you start with this idea of the Electoral College. You have debates at the Constitutional Convention, and it is passionate and excited between, like you said, President Madison, is it Congress who picks the president? Is it the people? Is it somewhere in between? All these brilliant ideas. Well, what we have today is most states have a winner-take-all system in their state. So right now, and I know your minds will be blown by this, but California has 55 electoral votes. I know you can gasp all you like, mind-blowing. It is a large state. Great example. Washington, D.C. has 3. So what are the questions around this? So some of the people believe that this is a great system, that it balances out the vote across the country and says that the candidates will not just earmark their way towards those big states only, that it gives more weight to smaller states like North Dakota, Alaska, but then also make sure that their voice is heard. So it's not just saying that the majority wins. So that is one kind of pro. There's a whole I'll share the podcast with you in the chat. There's a great podcast that we have at the Constitution Center. And for you guys, this would be an audio recording. And I know you have mind blown for you, but this is a great way to kind of hear both sides of the constitutional argument. And what we do at the Constitution Center is we focus on those constitutional arguments and discussions and conversations. So what is the constitutional question? Now, on the other side, people will say it's not fair. It is not an equal and fair system, and that we should have a direct vote. Now, there's a lot of in between. And what we find with so many constitutional conversations, we look at the law, we look at the changes, and we say there's also an in between. So a lot of people have come up with other solutions. And this is where I'd love to hear from our colonial people and our teacher. There's other options. There's 2 states in our country that are broken up by district voting. So we have Maine and we have Nebraska. And if everybody was staring at the map with the electoral votes coming in. You saw the candy stripe states, which I was fascinated because it's the first time I've ever seen the news do that. And that's because they're broken up by district. So 2 of their electoral votes go to the overall winner of the state, but the rest of the votes are broken up by sections of the state. So that's another alternative that people have proposed and states have taken on. And then there's also the national vote, which if there's an overall winner in the nation by popular vote, those states will go to it. I believe 12 states have signed on to that. So what I really encourage is that we present to all of our students, what are the key constitutional questions around the Electoral College? What are the questions that Hamilton and Madison had to grapple with? What are the questions that we have to grapple with today? And then have a dialogue about it. Our conversations really want to look at the Constitution, put it on the table, and then have a civil dialogue. So I'd love to know kind of your perspective on where you see that happening, and just throw a little bit of a wrench in the work. Very quickly, that Electoral College that you came up with was amended by the 12th Amendment because it wasn't working so perfectly. So could you share a little bit about, and I know you said it's not a perfect system, but a little bit about, in hindsight, things that you question about the Electoral College from the get-go, things that you thought were perfect and why you didn't want to go towards a national vote?
And before you prepare those answers, we do have one question as well that says, why don't all the states apportion electoral college votes according to the proportion of votes that the political parties get in each of those states? Surely that approach would be the fairest. And so I will let all of you, not only General Alexander and President Madison, please start with the foundation of it all, but then all of you comment on that question as well.
If I may begin, one aspect of which mode I would have certainly preferred the people directly. However, I had others who disagreed. Much of what we agreed to with the Electoral College was based on proportion. This was something that was emerged out of the Articles of Confederation, consideration for the smaller states as regards to not being overwhelmed by the larger states in population, such as Virginia or Massachusetts or Pennsylvania. States like New Jersey and Delaware, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Hampshire, feared that the larger states would hold sway. That is why, rather than, as I proposed, to have members of the Senate chosen from the House of Representatives, it was deemed that the state legislatures would choose the senators. This is, and in proportion, 2 senators per state. It was a holdover, quite frankly, from the Articles of Confederation, where each state had 1 vote, and each vote had to be unanimous. Well, that's getting apart from, but it was in terms of representation of each individual state. And thereby, if the electors could be representative of each state in that regard, then it was deemed more fair. General Madison, if you...
Hamilton, but the people are variable and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. Therefore, it is a good thing that we have the Electoral College, so that the common man, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, if you will not vote for the president of these United States. In the switching of the heads of government or replacing one president with another, it was thought best to give as little opportunity to tumult and disorder as possible. Nothing was more to be desired than every obstacle should be opposed to cabal, intrigue, and corruption. There are great fears, chiefly from a desire in foreign nations to put forward their own candidates, and how could they better achieve an influence on our elections and on our government than to put their own candidate into the office of chief magistrate. Now, we've done what we can with the Electoral College to provide the best system possible. Why not have a popular election? Well, as I said, the people very seldom determine right. It is feared that a president might be tempted to, in order to have a continuance in office, that he appeal to the public at large and be able to, some nefarious demagogue might be able to rise to the office by enlisting the low counsels of the common man.
General Hamilton, to that point there, and I'm sure President Madison, you have some comments on this as well. You talked about how the Electoral College is designed to be a check on demagogues, potentially rising to high federal office. Would it ever be theoretically okay for the Electoral College to overturn a vote by the people?
If you're asking, if the Electoral College is the system we use to elect our president, if the numbers, if the choice is different than the general election, so be it. The Electoral College is the means we have chosen to elect our president, and we must adhere to that. The law must always be supreme. You agree, don't you, Madison?
Well, this is in part an unfortunate consequence of our elections in terms of gerrymandering, as it's been termed. Thank you, Mr. Jerry. If the Electoral College represents the will of the people, then there is no issue. As the Electoral College electors are chosen by the people, there we can take solace that they reflect the will of the people.
So for students talking in the modern terms, President Madison was just speaking about like the Shalafico case. So this is the case that you may want to look up is around faithless electors. So if I interpreted that correctly, I would say Madison was saying that there should not be faithless electors. This was a court case that came through the Supreme Court last term, and it did say that the states are allowed to fine a faithless elector, somebody that does not go with the will of the people, up to $1,000. So, but if I heard the other side of this correctly, Mr. Hamilton, General Hamilton, you went with the electors are in position to make the right choices for what they believe, and they should go with what they think is correct. Is that, did I hear that right?
Yes, but of course they are elected, they are put in that place by those who have voted. And so they have a responsibility to adhere to that vote. But sometimes it may be that something new will come to light, and they must take that into account.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to one of my first questions, and this I'm going to target this towards Lawrence and President Madison. So the system is tricky. Let's not kid ourselves. It's not a simple system. In today's day and age, nobody has copied it. Not saying that's always a sign of a bad thing, but just saying, why? Why did you guys make it so tricky? And I really want to engage in this conversation about time and you keep talking about cabals and factions. Unpack that for our students in the group and say, what are you really talking about there? What does that really mean to the modern ear? And why do you put a trickier, harder system in place to put a president in? And then how do we engage it with ourselves through this process, watching the election, but also with each other on civil discourse. And what are some of the things we should do to be a community that engages in civil discourse and civil dialogue and compromise? Because you all compromised on the Electoral College. There was opposite ideas, and then you came together with this idea and thought it was the best compromise to move us forward. So that's a lot to unpack there. I'd love to see what Lawrence is doing in the class. We have a great tool on civil discourse online, and we love to have civil discourses. We do them in class every single week at the Constitution Center. You can join us with students around the country. But I'd really like to hear from our founding generation how important civil discourse was to you. And did you all ever raise your voices with each other? I know you were passionate, but did it ever get disrespectful?
You have heard of John Adams.
He wasn't at this convention.
Yeah, but his voice like a trumpet. He was called in the Jeffersonian press a hoary-headed incendiary. This is, of course, unprosecutable under the Sedition Act, as that is an entirely truthful statement. We digress. It was thought absolutely imperative to hold the selection of the president apart from those who would have a malintent or a bad influence. So we decided to have a temporary body that would be elected for that express purpose, divided in the various states, and by its very nature of being each college of electors in each several of the 13 states, it being a temporary body, it would be immune to cabal or to intrigue, it being too difficult to intrigue or have corruption over such a very distance over such a short period of time.
Indeed, indeed. That was the purpose. Also, they are elected representatives, elected by the people, which is a founding principle of Republican government. So they're, in addition to our House of Representatives being elected by the people immediately, then it seemed quite to go along with that.
We are a republic. We are not a democracy. None of us want to adhere to a democracy where every voice cries out in cacophony and anarchy. No, we have a representative government, and it is Alexander Pope once said, "For forms of government, let fools contest. What's best administered is best." And I think it's an over generalization, I guess, if you will, but in effect, it's going to come down to how is that practiced. And I think so far we have utilized the Electoral College supremely well. Just look at the election of 1800. It was immediately put to the test, a tie between Jefferson and Burr. And then ultimately, I found myself in the strange, unique position of being able to influence a body of people, whether to support Burr, a native New Yorker, or Jefferson. And Jefferson, though a man of very different principles, and believe we have our disagreements, though he's a man of very different principles, at least he has them. I'm sorry, I've completely gone off topic.
No, we
Yes,
love
as you
talking
were
about
about
the
to do.
election of 1800s. And this is a question in the Q&A about how can the Electoral College do a proper justice to ensure the effectiveness of a fair election. And I think you gave a great example there of ensuring that the people's voice are heard, ensuring that it's balanced, and then it was being put to the test during different elections. I find it fascinating to look at those elections over time and to see the marriage between when the popular vote won and when the electoral vote won. And I always like to bring up Abraham Lincoln was not the popular vote because he's usually a fan favorite. You may not know him. But Lawrence, I also wanted to kind of push this to you and say, how are your students grappling with civil dialogues around the election and how the system works and understanding that we're a republic?
Well, I think that's a very important point to note. One of the things I tried to impress in my classroom is that we are a constitutional federal republic, that we have a system of checks and balances and power is balanced between the national government and the states to ensure that everyone is represented fairly and equally. Now, as far as having civil dialogue goes, I think that's really important. I try to impress upon my students the importance of debating ideas, but not the people themselves. I think it was Dr. Franklin who said it's perfectly acceptable to attack a man in private, but when you do it in public, they tend to think you're serious. So when you are debating someone in debating the idea, no one can take it personally. You're debating the idea, and that's what's important. It's a contest of ideas. And one of the things about the Electoral College is I believe it's only 5 times it's happened in American history where the Electoral College winner was different from the popular vote winner. So the system works about 93% of the time. And that's a good batting average if you think about it. And I'm happy to talk to General Hamilton and President Madison about baseball.
About what?
I'm not familiar.
No, neither am I.
We'll talk offline.
Oh.
And so I'm going to have to go back to the presidential election. That is my favorite. And have Mr. Hamilton here. Could you talk a little bit more about the room where it happened? We like to say that the Steiner's Hall is the room where it happened, but I would love to know a little bit more about break down the battle in the 1800s election and kind of how you played a role in ensuring that to move forward and getting Congress out of the deadlock.
Well, early days in the cabinet, as a Secretary of Treasury and finding vehement opposition in Mr. Jefferson, we butted heads and went to it. I think at one point he describes us going to it as gladiators. I think, and Mr. Madison, I think you agree with me, and because we did get on so much in the early days when we were both part of the Confederational Congress under the Articles of Confederation. You spoke out against the anarchy of our system, and we both saw eye to eye, chiefly before I put forward the financial system, and then you blocked my assumption bill, a perfidious desertion of the principles you had sworn to uphold. But by the way, in forming the government and in going forward as Secretary of the Treasury and trying to do what we were trying to do, we became Federalists because we adhered to the federal government, because we believed in the federal government and were surprised. We had hoped to not have faction. We had hoped to not have political party. But then the anti-federalists were first striking at our federal government, and then Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Madison fell in line as well. Mr. Jefferson so much as to hire a member of the Department of State and give him a newspaper paid with State Department funds to decry against the federal government. So one might think, based on that, I could not support Jefferson when it came down to the election of 1800. But I think, let me give you a good example. Now, we were at war with France, and Mr. Madison might say that this was not quite a war, it was a quasi-war, but we were at war. They attacked our ships on the open seas. They came in and burned a port to the ground. Right? And I was general of the army. General Washington was head of the army, and we lost him, which was a tragic loss to us all. I was his second in command, and the army fell to me. And I wrote to Burr. I was having difficulty with Adams, with who doesn't, right? And then I was and the Congress, and he wrote back. Burr wrote to me, the Constitution is but a paper machine. You have it within your means to make yourself happy, meaning I had the army, I should go and take over the government. And I wrote back, that sort of thing is absolutely reprehensible. The military must always be subservient to the civilian authority. And Burr wrote back, great men do not trifle over morsels. That's the sort of man who could have been president of these United States. besides, I was able to get agreements from Mr. Jefferson and his associates as to they would retain our judges in office. They would support and gradually increase the Navy and stay out of the conflagrations in Europe.
President Madison,
Yes.
when this election is finally settled and we have a new president, there will be a large amount of the population that had not voted for them, of the voters. What I'd love to know, I read so much of your work about coming together, listening to each other, having conversations, the cooling down. What would you suggest to students and adults across the country about working together for the Republic and moving things together as a unit? You did that so well when the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists, and you were a part of it, discussing and debating, and then looking at the Bill of Rights and saying, okay, I don't agree with it, but I do know where they're coming from, and we need to bring the Anti-Federalists back into the fold and say, we are all Americans, we do this together. And one of the compromises I will make is when I'm in the first Congress to write and get that Bill of Rights moving, mostly because they're my really good ideas, but really, really important. So President Madison, what would you say to this generation of Americans about coming back into the fold, being all Americans together and building a stronger republic? And then Mr. Hamilton, I'd love to go to you after that, because I'm sure you have views.
Well, the Bill of Rights was an issue during the ratification process. I was opposed to having a Bill of Rights as part of the Constitution for many reasons. Chiefly among them was that states had certain interests, each state having a power center of interest, and they would force their interests through a Bill of Rights. They would then divert interest away from the ratification process of the Constitution, thereby creating mischiefs of various nature, not allowing the ratification process to go forward. I wanted to keep the Bill of Rights a separate issue. That said, I did come to an understanding that many of the states that do have bills of right, this seemed to be a repetition. However, I made it a promise because it was the will of the people that I would be carrying out. And while in Congress, it was an effort to actually implement the Bill of Rights into being ratified and added to our Constitution. Much of what was discussed in the Constitutional Convention, we were at great odds at. It was a wonder that so many variety of opinions that clashed could actually come to any concord. I gave up quite a bit. I sacrificed quite a bit of what I wanted the Constitution to look like and what our framing would be for our self-government. We do have a republic. Yes, that is the case. However, it does have democratic tools, as it were. It is a unique instrument. It is a unique machine, as it has been said. And it has been tried nowhere else in the world. We have done so because of a coming together, a meeting of minds to agree, sometimes to disagree, but agree on what we can agree on and move our country forward.
A Bill of Rights.
Mr. Hamilton, please,
Yes.
we're going to give you the last word, and then I have an enormous amount of thank yous. If you all can't believe that it's 5:58 already, please, General Hamilton.
But thank you so much for giving me the last word. I rarely do so, particularly in my home, the Grange. My dear wife, Eliza. No, for a Bill of Rights is absolutely unnecessary. I go further and affirm that a Bill of Rights would even be dangerous, for the Bill of Rights will contain various exceptions to those powers not granted, and on that very account will afford a colorable pretext to claim more than were granted. For why declare these things shall not be done, which there is no power to do? If it does not say in the Constitution, you do not have a right, then you have that right of force. And by allowing the government to delineate those rights, you are saying the government has a right to delineate and to limit those rights. We have disagreed along the way, and we have come to compromise. You know, it has frequently been remarked that it seems to be reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to determine the truly important question, whether societies of men are capable or not of establishing good government from. Are we no more fit for the rein and the spur, or can we indeed govern ourselves? We have fought side by side to make America free. Let us struggle hand in hand to make her happy as well. Thank you so much for your time.
So I would simply say that, as most people would say, through the whole process, there are only two things that you don't want most people to see, and that's how legislation and sausage is being made. First of all, we want to thank General Hamilton. We want to thank President Madison. We want to thank Carrie from the National Constitution Center. We'd like to thank Mr. Staten from the Washington Latin Public Charter School, all of our attendees. I would like to thank the American Historical Theater as well. Please, all of the attendees, if you go to not only the National Constitution Center, but our own page at the Center for Education Reform, we have two critical things that I want to make sure that all of you see. At whyamerica.edreform.com, if you look across the top on the menu, we have a Master Teacher Recognition Program. There are deadlines, but you can win some great prizes. We have a student essay challenge as well, and we would ask you all, please, teachers, to look at that. Those are all on that website that I mentioned to you. I would especially like to welcome, and I believe we are going to be able to hear a little bit more of their music. Once again, the old fife and drum corps. But more importantly, before we go to that music, I just want to say once again, please, I know we were limited this year as to what we could do during COVID, but God willing, next November 11th, when you have a day off, take a veteran to lunch. Do more than just lay a wreath or watch a old movie on TV and think that that covers it for Veterans Day. Take a veteran to lunch, visit a veterans hospital, maybe even make a phone call to someone you know who's a veteran and perhaps lives alone, and just listen to the stories, because if it weren't for all of them, we wouldn't have this remarkable experiment that we call the United States of America, that gentlemen like Mr. Madison and Mr. Hamilton so graciously gave to us a long time ago. And on that note, Sergeants, I think we are either going to play a video of music that you have provided, or are we going to give live another shot? Let me know, and we'll see. I think it's a video, correct?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. And I think the sound should be a little bit improved. So with that note, as we play it out from our friends in the old fife and drum corps, we thank you all this evening, and thank you so much. And please do not forget to register for our next event coming up in the near future, and you will all receive notice of that soon.
Sound, ceasefire. Drums.